Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for September 22nd, 2023. While the battle continues in New York City at the UN General Assembly over the fight to establish a new strategic and development architecture, I'll have a short report on that in the update today, and then I'll be taking your questions since this is Friday, and I have two general questions that I'll be addressing. But let's start with the UN General Assembly. There's a continuing impassioned expression coming from nations of the global south, including from Africa, for the need for a new development architecture to replace the strangulation, the anti-development strangulations that's been placed on nations through the institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which operate on behalf of the global financial and corporate cartels, which are committed to maintaining a unipolar order, which means continuing the impoverishment of Africa. But we're seeing a change in that. Nations are refusing to accept their subjugation. And let me give you two quick notes on what happened in the last couple of days. Yesterday, Burundi's president made two powerful points. His name is Ndayishimiye, and he spoke about the fact that he said Africa is not poor. When people talk about Africa as being poor, the continent is rich in raw materials and resources, and among those resources are the large population of young people. He said, under the present system, however, nations are not even allowed to meet their current needs, much less be able to contribute to the development of all humanity. And toward this end, he cited a saying from his country, which is, quote, prosperity is only lasting if it is shared, unquote. And in his speech, he basically presented an offer to collaborate with the nations of the North, not out of hatred, but out of love, to build a post-colonial world. Well, people like Blinken, Biden, Sunak, Macron, and others should pay attention to the sentiments coming from Africa, because the ability to move toward this new system, if it's not done quickly, will have a calamitous effect for the nations of the global north, because they'll be isolated and cut off from the development which will take place with the cooperation of the BRICS and others. Now, the second thing from the UN was that there was a BRICS foreign ministers meeting there yesterday, where instead of backing away from expansion, instead of backing away from their stand that was taken against the G7 at the G20 meeting, they reiterated their commitment to an all-inclusive development approach. And this is not good news for those who wish to continue the unipolar order. Now, otherwise, the escalation to continue the war is going on. Biden offered another $300+ million to Zelensky after his trip to Washington. He was not allowed to address the Congress, but the $300 million is on top of the tens of billions, perhaps over $100 billion already provided. And then Zelensky headed to Canada, and I'll get to that in a moment. But to give you a sense of the desperate attempt to rally support for a losing situation, The Economist magazine, the flagship publication of the City of London, has a cover story which recognizes the failure of the counteroffensive under the headline, Time for a Rethink. Now, what do they say? They say a change is needed in military strategy and economic strategy for Ukraine. Ukraine and its backers, The Economist writes, quote, need to plan for a long struggle, unquote. In other words, an admission from the City of London itself of the need for a permanent war. And the purpose of the permanent war is not to help Ukraine, but to destroy Russia. Now, in the meantime, we're seeing cracks that are getting bigger in Europe. Most significantly, the Polish-Ukraine relationship, which is tumbling downward with the announcement that Poland is not going to provide any more military aid to Ukraine. This comes on top of Polish protests of the shipment of cheap Ukrainian grain to Poland, which is undercutting the Polish farmers. And so we see this developing. There are other countries, I think, that have joined Poland in this. I think Hungary is one of them. But the constant begging for support, the flooding of these countries with immigrants from Ukraine, this is wearing thin. And the question remains how much longer they can sustain this fight when they're running out of material in Ukraine, running out of ammunition in NATO and the United States, and running out of men who can fight. So this is a dramatic situation, a significant change underway. When will the recognition finally come that this was a mistake from the beginning, based on the idea that an expansion of NATO into Russia, the Russian border, is the way to destroy Russia? It's not going to work. If it continues, it could lead to a destruction of the human race. Now, let me take up the two questions. I was asked for comments on the flap over Elon Musk and his Starlink system, which I'm sure most of you have heard about. The report came out from Walter Isaacson's new biography on Musk, which said that Musk canceled the coverage of the Black Sea and Crimea from the Starlink satellite system at the point at which Ukraine was about to launch an attack on the Black Sea fleet of Russia last September. Now, it turns out that what Isaacson had in his book was wrong. What Musk clarified is that there was never coverage for the Crimea, Black Sea area. That Musk was concerned from the beginning that this would, as he said, could become a mini Pearl Harbor if the Ukrainians use the Starlink system to attack the Russian fleet, and that this could lead to nuclear war, certainly to an escalation. Now, Musk was absolutely right to deny the use of Starlink for such an offensive attack against the Russians, because it would have been a mini Pearl Harbor, and the push from the British has been from the start to create what they called a Crimean missile crisis. And what's interesting is that Musk is under attack on this for showing sound judgment. That is, the people who are pushing the war are willing to go to the brink of nuclear war. Musk said no. In fact, he's been very generous to Ukraine. He's allowed them to use the Starlink system to keep their cyber networks up. In some cases, it's used for targeting. And yet a top assistant or advisor to Zelensky named Mikhailo Podolyak launched a brutal attack on Musk, saying that Musk is a supporter of killing children on behalf of his ego. And this is part of the line coming out from the Ukrainian regime, attacking a person who's actually been very generous to Ukraine. But there's a bigger issue here, and the bigger issue includes why he was willing to do this in the first place. And that goes to this question of the integration of big tech companies into the military-industrial complex. There are many of them, including Google, including Microsoft, including Palantir, are involved in targeting, are involved in mapping, are providing all kinds of services that are part of modern warfighting, including AI software and so on. Now, what this means is that whether they were doing it out of generosity, which some of them were initially, including Musk, or whether they were getting paid for it. And by the way, there's a report that the U.S. Agency for International Development, AID, is providing over $20 billion for the Ukrainian tech sector. The total annual budget of AID, which is supposed to be foreign aid to help nations develop, is $60 billion. But from February 2022 to the present, over $20 billion of that has gone to the Ukrainian tech sector for the war. So there is a U.S. government component here funding these tech companies, but some of it is voluntary support coming from the tech companies. Well, the question is, what does it mean when you have private companies with individual entrepreneurs like Musk or other powerful individuals, billionaires, who are making the policy for a foreign government. This is something which should be examined. Instead, the senators are saying that Musk should be attacked for not being willing to start World War III to facilitate the Russian fleet being sunk in the Black Sea. Now, the other question from this is, why is Congress still afraid to go after big tech for censorship? And I have an article on this that will be posted on this site probably by the end of the weekend, which I would encourage you to read to get more insights into the role of big tech as part of the military-industrial complex. Now, the other question, and I have this from a number of people, is to talk about what's going on in Canada. Now, most people in the United States think of Canada as our northern neighbor, a kind of peaceful country, playing hockey and living their lives and somewhat depending on the United States for security. But in fact, Canada is an integral part of both the intelligence operation of the Five Eyes as well as NATO. Remember, the Canadian Air Force was one of 4 countries, with France, Britain, and the United States, responsible for the destruction of Libya, and bears some responsibility because of that, through its bombing and its support for the terrorists, the ISIS-linked terrorists, for the deaths from the flooding which just occurred, which, by the way, the media tends to ignore, that it was the destruction in 2011 of the Gaddafi government which paved the way for this crisis. But let me start by saying I send my props to the Canadians who participated in the March for Children out of opposition to the coercive government efforts to push transgenderism through the schools. But the other side of the Canadian situation is the role of Trudeau as a junior partner, junior varsity, you might say, like Blinken, as part of the British war machine, and in that, the transatlantic war machine. As I said, Canada is an integral part of NATO. It's been involved in training Ukrainians and fighting the war. The Five Eyes is part of the international spy network and intelligence gathering network, which includes Canada. But as we see now, Zelensky's in Canada today. What's he doing there? Well, besides the money, he's there to meet with the Ukrainian diaspora, but there's a particularly nasty side to this Ukrainian diaspora, which is the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland. Her grandfather, Michael Chomiak, was an active participant with the Nazis in carrying out pogroms against Jews, Russians, Poles, and others in Galicia during World War II, coordinating with the Nazi SS and the Bandera movement. The fact that Freeland is the deputy prime minister and an outspoken supporter of the Ukraine war should be raising red flags around the world, but no one mentions it because no one wants to address the fact that there's a Nazi component in Ukraine which Putin pointed his finger at as one of the leading reasons why he was concerned with the NATO expansion and providing weapons of mass destruction to the Ukrainian government, which includes banderistas and neo-Nazis in their defense and security forces. So it's not surprising that Zelensky would go to Canada and be welcomed by the Deputy Prime Minister and Trudeau himself, although Trudeau is little more than a puppet of these war hawk interests. And also, by the way, of the City of London banksters. Now, but the other question here, as you probably have heard, Trudeau said that there now exist credible allegations that the Indian government was involved in the murder of a Khalistani separatist leader in British Columbia back in June. Now, the Khalistan movement is calling for a separation of the Sikh population from India to have their own separate country. They're a very small minority among the Sikhs, but a leader of them was killed in what's being called by Trudeau an assassination. And Trudeau is saying that the Indian government was involved in this assassination. Now, think about the timing of this. The assassination was in June. Here we are near the end of September. What has happened in that intervening period of time? It's become clear that India is not going to break with Russia and with the BRICS. There's enormous pressure. Sometimes it's called a charm offensive, but it's also blackmail threats, economic threats, and now this kind of threat coming from Trudeau that's designed to put pressure on India to back away from the commitment to the BRICS for a new strategic and development architecture. The attempt to break India away has not worked. Biden has tried it. There's the establishment of the Quad. There's talk about using the India-China tensions to do that. So what's the point of now starting increased tensions between Canada and India? Clearly, this is an orchestrated effort to try to weaken India and to cast a bad light on the Indian government. I don't think it's going to work. I think what's more important now is that the Canadians who are in the streets marching, the truckers from last year, the parents from the fight for the March for Children, it's time to clean out the British networks that control your country. Whether you know it or not, or like it or not, Canada is still an active part of the British Commonwealth. It would be better if Canada adopted an independent posture, such as India is doing. But that's going to depend on a mobilization of the good people of Canada. And I offer my support to you for that. It's an important part of shifting the policy in the global north away from commitment to sustaining a unipolar order, which benefits only a small handful of billionaires and their corporate cartels. So thanks for joining me this week. I will be posting in the description page a link to my interview with Helga Zepp-LaRouche this week, where she went through in greater detail the battles going on now at the UN General Assembly and in the world as a whole. So thanks for joining me. Have a good weekend. See you next week.